My city was always quiet. No events, no surprises, just monotony that flowed smoothly from day to day. When the posters for the new circus arrived in town, they immediately caught my eye. The posters read in large letters, "The Puppeteer's Circus invites you. Look at yourself without a mask." The words sounded strange, so their meaning was beyond my head. The image on the poster was also out of the ordinary. A theater mask with cracks from which eyes were peeking out, like a look from inside something broken. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. Just another circus, I thought. However, a day later, the whole city began to talk about it. People on overloaded electric trains discussed the mysterious phrases on the posters, and snatches of arguments could be heard from houses on the way to the market. Someone said that this was just an advertising gimmick. Someone. That this circus was unique. The noise only increased when the first performances began. Crowds of spectators flocked to the tents, the burning lanterns drawing scarlet stripes against the dark background. No one knew what kind of show they were about to see. However, after the performances, something strange happened. People left the circus completely different. Some were beaming with laughter, as if they had learned an incredible secret. Others had faces distorted with fear. They stared into space, tightly pressing their lips. Sometimes there were completely pale people, as if they had just emerged from a nightmare. This became even more mysterious. No unity. Some were happy about this show, others were tormented. I thought about this for several days. What could cause such strong, different emotions? Circuses were never places of revelation. They only entertained, distracted from routine life. But in this circus, everything was different. And yet the main question for me remained the phrase on the poster, "Look at yourself without a mask." Why without a mask? What did it mean? Curiosity began to burn inside me. I couldn't let go of this thought. In the end, I bought a ticket. The circus grounds greeted me with lights, a haze of burnt oil, and a strange array of smells. Cotton candy, roasted peanuts, and something metallic, barely perceptible. The evening sky glowed dimly behind a tent with a massive sign, "Puppeteer's Circus," made of light bulbs. They flickered, almost merging with the dim light of the lanterns. It was immediately clear that you wouldn't find the usual entertainment here. There were no carousels here, rattling with the melody of a cheap ride, and the usual petting zoo where tired animals always doze. Instead, I noticed two tents that stood out from the general picture, the panic room and the room of distorted mirrors. People were making noise around them, but there was not a drop of joy in their voices. It was a tense, indistinct hum, as if everyone was unsure whether they wanted to go inside. I walked past. I wasn't interested in these amusements. Perhaps they might have intrigued me before, but not after I'd seen the faces of the people leaving the circus the day before. The real answer was hidden in the main tent, under a thick layer of stretched fabric, where the show was hidden. At the entrance stood the ticket collector. His motionless face was almost lost in the shadows, as if everything about him was made of wax. His smile seemed frozen, but his hand smoothly tore off the corner of each ticket. My gaze met his eyes. At that moment, I felt a strange heaviness, as if this man could see more than I was willing to show. I took the rest of the ticket from him and went inside. The hall was huge, with rows of benches that seemed to stretch into infinity. Despite the multitude of people, it seemed that everyone was sitting in their own separate cage of silence. Above the dome, lanterns burned dimly, like stars. And in the center, illuminated by a dim light, stood a small stage. It seemed as if this place was prepared not for entertainment, but for something entirely different. I sat down. There were quiet, rustling sounds on the benches. No one was talking, but the tension was palpable. Suddenly, the lights in the dome began to fade. The hum of voices anticipating the beginning of the show disappeared, giving way to perfect silence. A few moments later, The host appeared on stage. His image was strange to the point of strangeness. His face was smooth as if it were carved from marble. Perfectly straight features dressed in a suit that fit too well. A man who was hard to look away from. His movements were so smooth that it seemed he almost did not touch the ground. He looked around the audience and, without saying a word, smiled. The smile seemed wary, as if it were a test for those who were looking at it. The show began. In the first minutes, I realized that this circus was different, completely different. When the lights in the hall completely went out, I felt how the air around me became heavier. Tension filled every crack in the tent. It seemed like the dome itself was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable. On the stage, in a beam of dim light, the host was still standing. His motionless gaze smoothly slid over the crowd as if he was looking for something in the faces of the audience. A minute of silence seemed like an eternity, but suddenly sounds filled the space. Figures began to move around the stage, at first indistinguishable due to the gloom. They were in no hurry to come out into the bright light, remaining within the limits of the penumbra. Noticing their outlines, I shuddered. They were actors, but they looked as if they had come out of some gloomy illustrations. Creatures appeared on the stage one after another. Some looked like caricatures of people, huge humps, elongated limbs, faces with crooked features. Others barely resembled human. Twisted bodies, skin torn into bumps, sinister masks from which paint was pouring. At the same time, everything was so realistic that every detail gave rise to a dull fear somewhere inside. The freaks began to act out scenes. However, these were not ordinary tricks. The artists literally reproduced scenes of human life, full of pain, hidden truth. Before my eyes, a young couple was arguing over betrayal. The woman screamed, twisted with rage, and the husband stood with his head down. The whole production was animated by horrific details. It seemed that each line concealed something that each of us had once experienced but desperately tried to forget. The next scene was performed by two men portraying comrades who turned into enemies, betraying each other for profit. One of them on stage screamed so desperately that the audience froze, as if each spectator was afraid that the actor would look him straight in the eye. I noticed how people in the audience fidgeted nervously. Some pressed their fingers tightly to their lips, others turned away. Each subsequent moment of the performance seemed to crawl under the skin. Feelings, and scenes, emotions. Everything seemed terrifyingly personal. Sitting in the darkness, I caught myself thinking that each of the actors seemed to be the embodiment of someone's inner demon. Each freak personified an emotion or fear that was too weak to hide any longer. Whispers began to fill the room. Someone was trying to calm the tension growing inside. It was becoming increasingly difficult for me to be there. I felt the cold fingers of anxiety squeezing my chest. With each new act, the circus revealed the most hidden layers of human nature, taking out from the crowd exactly what everyone was trying to hide. At some point, my curiosity gave way to a feeling of discomfort. This circus was something more than just a performance. It exposed not only on stage, but also inside the audience, layer by layer, to the very core. I was already thinking about leaving the room. I could not stand this atmosphere any longer. Each performance only pressed harder, as if a cold heaviness rolled from the stage and filled me from within. These strange freaks, their creepy scenes, all this hit the most vulnerable. They seemed to read the audience, drawing out fears, doubts, and shame. I stood up carefully, trying not to draw attention to myself. The audience remained motionless, except for the occasional quiet sigh or nervous movement. As I passed the seated audience, I noticed how their eyes were glued to the stage, as if mesmerized. Their faces were distorted with horror, embarrassment, or delight, but no one looked away. I walked down the row, feeling my footsteps echoing as the music continued. Each step was an effort, as if the air in this tent had become thick, viscous. Finally, I reached the passage leading to the exit. In front of me, a thin beam of light was visible, cutting through the heavy darkness of the circus tent. All I wanted was to be outside, to feel the fresh night air. As soon as I approached the edge of the tent, my breathing became easier. But as soon as I took the last step, I felt a powerful blow. A huge hand grabbed my shoulder and powerful fingers squeezed me so that I could barely breathe. I turned my head to see my attacker. It was one of the freaks. A large man with unnaturally broad shoulders, but with a face childish. His eyes looked at me with some kind of dull naivety, but there was nothing childish in his brute strength. He yanked me toward him, jerking me back. My heart was beating somewhere in my throat. I tried to break free, but it was pointless. His grip was steel. I opened my mouth to scream, but felt a blow to the head. The world exploded in bright flashes of light, which immediately disappeared, pulling me into a black void. When I came to, the first thing I felt was a strange feeling of heaviness, as if my face was walled up in a dense shell. I tried to touch myself, but my fingers barely touching the skin stumbled upon something hard and cold. My heart sank somewhere down. It was a mask. I jerked up, seized by panic. My whole body seemed alien. I felt how my muscles moved with difficulty, as if every movement was pulled by invisible threads. There was an old, dirty mirror hanging right in front of me, and what I saw in the reflection made me recoil. It wasn't my face. It resembled the disfigured performers I'd seen on stage. Twisted features, every line a grotesque parody of human emotion. The lips were stretched into a forced grin. The eyes were illuminated by dark shadows, and the skin wasn't skin. It seemed plastic, but eerily alive. There was a deep crack down my left cheek, as if I were a doll that someone had accidentally dropped. The horror gripped me with renewed vigor when I looked down at my hands. They were different. Large, with hideously twisted fingers and pale, mottled skin. It took me a few minutes to realize that this was not a dream. My panic only intensified when I noticed black writing on my forearm, as if burned into the skin. Property of the puppeteer. I turned around trying to find the exit. The trailer I was in looked old and falling apart. Shabby costumes, parts of the scenery, dusty dolls and masks were piled up everywhere. But the door that led outside seemed so far away. As soon as I took a step towards the exit, a quiet chuckle was heard from the corner. I turned around. On the floor sat one of those freaks who had been looking at me in the trailer. Her face was twisted into a wild grimace, and her eyes were shining with evil mirth.
You are one of us. Welcome to the family.
The freak's voice cut through the air, drawn out and creepy. At that very moment, the door of the trailer opened. Through the crack, I saw the performers stepping out into the dark night one by one. Some were laughing, some were making inhuman screams. They scattered in different directions, merging with the darkness. I tried to step in that direction, but suddenly realized that my legs wouldn't obey me, as if someone was pulling invisible strings behind my back, directing me wherever this evil master wanted. My body turned toward the exit, but not to escape. I knew that from that moment on, I would become a part of this sinister performance, an actor in a circus that takes away not only freedom, but also human essence. I felt the dark night swallow me up. Now, I was nothing more than one of those who on stage portray the hidden fears and vices of others. I was part of the puppeteer's circus,